The almost certain confirmation of Marty Makary as FDA Commissioner later this month will cap a tumultuous transition at FDA and HHS more broadly, one that's been marked by internal upheaval and political infighting. We discuss last Thursday's confirmation hearing on the Hill and how Makary's testimony hinted at what we can expect from his agenda at FDA. Plus, could Amylin outshine GLP-1 in obesity? We'll hear from our colleague Stephen Hansen on the promise of amylin agonists in obesity. We'll also have an editor's perspective from Editor-in-Chief Simone Fishburne. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and this is the BioCentury This Week podcast. I'm joined by my colleagues
Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Okay, Steve, you came back from vacation for a very important reason. Late last week, Marty Makary up on the Hill. He's up for FDA Commissioner. You've written that he is pretty sure to get the nod. What did you learn by listening to his testimony?
So, I think the overall impression is this is someone who wants to succeed in his job, and he realizes that doing so requires a well-functioning agency. He's not setting out to burn it down. He didn't give the impression that he has a hyper-partisan agenda. He didn't give many clues on what he'd like to achieve, some, but those that he did were pretty vague. And he didn't say much about some of the really big issues that are facing FDA, nor was he pushed to talk about those things. I think in the kind of like the 800-pound gorilla in the room, he repeatedly told the health committee that he had no role in and no knowledge of the DOJ's actions to cut staff at FDA. He did commit that he's going to do his own assessment of staffing and personnel, and reiterated that he didn't have anything to do with the decisions that have been made earlier. On the other hand, he also didn't really display a really firm grasp of the agency's history and kind of things that have happened before. So, for example, about the layoffs, he said, well, there have been some layoffs. Some people were hired back, but he said, to put things in context, that there's been a doubling of the agency, the number of employees at the agency since 2007, kind of suggesting maybe that there's some fat to trim there. But the truth is that FDA's workforce has grown because its workload has grown, right? And for example, 1,100 employees in the Center for Tobacco Products were added after 2009. Every single one of them is paid for by user fees. And there are a lot of other examples of ways the Congress has expanded FDA's mission since 2007, and also user fees have expanded dramatically since then. So I think that his statement there was a little bit misleading, but overall, my impression is, look, this is a guy who wants to make things work, and he's going to realize very quickly that the way to make things work is to figure out how to support FDA staff. And to the extent that he does that, he will be successful. And to the extent that he doesn't do it, he won't be.
Steve, I think this is one of the biggest things on biopharma executives' mind. It's like, who's the FDA commissioner going to be? I think we've talked enough about RFK Jr. and being head of HHS and what that means, but that's sort of at a high level, really more a public health thing. So do you think biopharma executives will look at Makary, or should look at Makary and go, look, he's qualified, he knows what he's doing, we can handle this? Could have been much worse, one thing we could say. How do you think they should look at this, or is it still part of this massive unknown and uncertainty idea that's sort of been a common theme since the inauguration, I would say, or even before?
Look, he is qualified. On paper, he has the credentials that are impressive. His demeanor at the hearing, suggests that he's taking the job seriously and believes in FDA's mission. On the other hand, we don't know really what he wants to accomplish. I've written and said many times, that every FDA commissioner redefines the job. We don't know how Makary is really thinking of the job, what he's planning to do. He really didn't give a lot of clues there. Some of the things that he did talk about, he talked about ultra rare, said that FDA's regulatory standards for ultra rare diseases need to be tailored to fit the reality that you can't do, or you certainly can't always do, large double-blinded placebo-controlled trials when you've got a population of only 15 or 50 people with a condition. He also said, well, that he wants to look at some big picture questions. So he said that FDA needs to use common sense to ask some big questions that we've never asked before at FDA. And one of those that he said is, why does it take 10 years for a drug to get approved? Well, of course, that's a big question, but it's not like it's never been asked before. It's been asked many times. I think every commissioner asks that question, and they all come up with different ideas. And there's a whole, raft of things that FDA has done over the years to try to get drugs approved more rapidly, accelerated approval, breakthrough, and things like that. But I think people will be heartened that Makary is asking that question. Pointing out a problem like that is easy. He didn't say anything about what he is thinking about doing to speed drug reviews, or even about how he would identify ways to go about doing that. That's really going to be what's going to be the key, I think. Does he find ways to turn these instincts that he has, these ideas that he has, that FDA needs to reduce the impediments to drug development, at least in some classes of drugs? Does he find ways to turn that into reality? And how is he going to respond to pressures from the White House, from RFK Jr., to reduce staff, to intervene in places where RFK, has his own ideas about what FDA should do, and they don't necessarily align well with the public health? Those are the real questions. How's he going to handle those kinds of issues?
So one question on that front, Steve. So in terms of the efficiency of drug development, certainly in terms of shots on goal and where the world is going, obviously AI and data science is a very big and important part of the landscape. Scott Gottlieb, who was FDA commissioner 3 commissioners ago, I think at the beginning of Trump's first term, he actually seemed to be quite a big advocate. He brought in A.B. Abernathy and was really trying to increase the skill sets and thinking within FDA about data science and AI. One concern that I've heard among people is that with getting rid of probationary employees, among those are the younger, newer ones who actually might be more adept in some of the more advanced and innovative aspects of data science, AI, and drug development. Do you have any insights into where he might sit in that spectrum, or any of his thoughts on that front?
Well, he didn't say anything about it, and he is faced with a really difficult challenge. A lot of probationary employees were fired. Some of them were rehired, but FDA is not a happy place right now, and it's not going to be easy for him to even get the authorization to hire new staff. If he gets that authorization, it's going to be very difficult for him to recruit really first-rate people that FDA needs. Solving that problem is going to be, I think, key to his success at FDA. He needs to be able to bring in young people. He needs to be able to bring in people who think differently and have skills in areas that the people who have been at FDA for decades may not have. And AI is probably the top of that list.
Steve, things are moving fast these days, and quite a lot has happened since this hearing just a few days ago. We've got a new chief of staff at FDA, and you've got an update on the buyout offer for FDA employees.
Yeah, so about the buyout offer, it isn't just FDA. It went out across HHS. There was an offer that staff had that if they are willing to resign within a short period of time, I think 4 or 5 days, they would get a $25,000 bonus. What's interesting is that FDA review staff and inspection staff are not eligible for that. So they've kind of taken on board, HHS has taken on board the idea that it's really not a good idea to try to incentivize reviewers or inspectors to walk out the door quickly. On the chief of staff, yeah, they've got a new chief of staff. His name is Jim Traficant. That's a really key job. Traficant has had a long tenure working in government, in the private sector, related to government, I should say, and also seems to have had some overlap with Marty Makary.
Any relation to that old lawmaker, Steve, that...
No, I don't think you're going to be hearing anything from this Jim Traficant about beaming me up, or it's eccentric things that the former representative Jim Traficant used to say. No, they're a completely different guy.
Okay. We are going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back to talk about obesity therapies.
BioCentury This Week is supported by the BioCentury Conference Series. For 3 decades, BioCentury has helped biopharma executives and investors make business-critical decisions and build larger networks with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our goals are simple: gather the right people in the room to partner, network, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. BioCentury's upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal making and investment. We hope to see you on the road at an upcoming BioCentury event. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information and to register.
Alrighty, we are back, and as our listeners know, incretin-based therapies have dominated the weight loss space for some time now, but Stephen Hansen tells me that competition is coming from amylin agonists. Stephen, what are some of the advantages that these therapies have that could help them overtake GLP-1 as the preferred monotherapy, or perhaps, dare I say, combination?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Well, some of our regular listeners might recall from last week, we sort of touched on this topic a little bit in relation to the deal that AbbVie and Gubra did. AbbVie spent $350 million up front to acquire Gubra's phase 1 amylin agonist. And it just so happened that I was already sort of in the midst of working on this story, looking at the sort of broader field here. And so I'm sure everyone's, very well aware of kind of the issues that GLP-1s face. Primarily, they revolve around GI tolerability issues, nausea, vomiting, these sorts of things. And then sort of the growing recognition is around the quality of the weight loss that you get. So typically with a incretin-based therapy, you have sort of both fat and lean mass loss. It's sort of indiscriminate as to which type of mass is sort of preferentially shed. And those are kind of the 2 primary areas where I think amylin, at least based on the early clinical data and preclinical data that's out there, have at least the potential to really show an improvement. So we've already seen clinical data, early clinical data, and we've already seen some phase 3 data as well, because there was a amylin monotherapy arm in the Novo Agrisema phase 3 studies. And, there we've already seen that there is reduced issues around tolerability, so an improved tolerability profile. And then sort of where there's growing evidence, and this is all still preclinical, so I think this still has to be validated in the clinic, but there's this potential with amylin signaling to drive preferential fat mass loss. So one of the ideas is that signaling through amylin basically triggers resensitization to leptin, a hormone that's involved in satiety, but also is involved in sort of an adiposity signal, basically telling the body that there are still sort of fat cells that are there that can be used for energy. And so basically with amylin, you sort of resensitize to that leptin signaling, and you drive this sort of preferential fat burn relative to lean mass. So companies are kind of working on ways to measure that now in the clinic. And so I think that's what I'm really looking forward to sort of over the course of the rest of this year. I think we'll start to get some clinical data coming out that hopefully starts to substantiate that potential for amylin agonism to have this sort of lean or muscle mass sort of preservation quality to it.
Thanks, Stephen. I thought this is a really interesting story. When I read the story, and you stipulate to the fact that for the severe obese or obesity population, incretins will remain the therapies of choice because the amount of weight loss there is really the primary concern. But, everybody listening to this knows many people who are not severe obese. They might be overweight. I don't know if there's sort of a mild obesity range. Yep. And I'm not even talking about the Hollywood ones who are actually not even remotely there. But, there's a fair amount of uptake in that population where actually you could easily make an argument that the quality of weight loss is much more important than the absolute number of it, meaning the number of pounds you lose or kilos, whichever part of the world you're in. So I think that that's a really important and interesting part of it, because it really, the information you presented left me believing that amylin really could overtake GLP-1s or amylin plus GLP-1s, maybe a combination is part of where that data went. So I just think it would be very helpful to those who were not lucky enough to read your amazing story. And everybody knows I'm a sucker for a G protein coupled receptor. So there's that. But maybe just if you can walk through the biology a little bit of how these work. And, I know that what we've seen is that on a safety front or tolerability front, there's early clinical data, but the mechanism of action, the efficacy front is still all preclinical. And so that's sort of waiting to be seen if it bears out in the clinic. But just walk us through the biology of how they work, can you?
Sure. Yeah, no, of course. So at this point in time, there's kind of three different, let's call them flavors, three different flavors of molecules that companies are developing. So you have DACRAs, which are these dual amylin and calcitonin agonists. Something of a misnomer in a way, I think, because largely they're based on a sort of salmon calcitonin background. So these are molecules that tend to have a stronger calcitonin signaling. And I should back up here and explain. So one of the challenges here is that the amylin receptor is actually a heterodimer with a calcitonin receptor and a ramp protein. So that is a receptor activity modifying protein. So you have 3 amylin receptors, but then you also have the calcitonin receptor. And so effectively, when you're developing a molecule to try and activate the amylin, you really have activity on both the amylin and the calcitonin. It's really, the question is whether you have sort of a biased molecule that has larger activity on amylin. Companies like AstraZeneca and Lilly kind of have gone for this route where they're trying to have more stronger sort of amylin signal and reduce sort of the calcitonin signaling aspect. Or you have a DACRA, which tends to have a stronger calcitonin signaling aspect to it, but also hits on amylin. Or then you have sort of this third flavor, which is what people were telling me was sort of a balanced agonist that hits sort of all 3 equally, which is more what you would see with a endogenous amylin. And so each of these kind of gives, I guess, what's sort of up for debate is whether how much better things are if you hit amylin versus calcitonin, or how much meaning this is going to have down the road in terms of what you see in the clinic. But some of the hope is that, if you drive the amylin signaling, that's where you can maybe drive the leptin sensitization. That's maybe where you get more of the tolerability improvements, because hitting calcitonin can be part of the issue where you can see some of the GI tolerability there. But one of the other aspects is around sort of overall efficacy. So the companies like Novo or Zealand or Gubra who are developing balanced agonists, they would argue that having a balanced agonist gives you kind of the best of both worlds. Whereas the biased amylin agonist would argue, well, we don't get as much efficacy because we're not hitting calcitonin, but it's also because we're more strongly driving this fat burn relative to lean mass. And so because you're just losing fat mass and you're not losing as much lean mass, you don't have as much overall weight loss. And so while the percentage number for an amylin biased, agonist is probably not going to be as high as with some of the other ones, the quality of that weight loss might be better. And so that's some of the sort of the debate and arguments that's kind of going on in terms of how you do this. And again, as you said, a lot of this data is preclinical. So still, I think, be interesting to see how it bears out in the clinic, as to how meaningful these differences are between, these level of activity on amylin versus calcitonin. But I think it does make for some interesting decisions that companies have to make early on, when they decide what to go with. And I think we've already kind of seen that from Lilly, because they had both a DACRA and an amylin biased agonist in the clinic. And they last quarter, they discontinued their DACRA program and are now progressing with their amylin biased agonist forward. So I don't think they've commented too much on it yet, but to me, their actions kind of speak for the direction in which they think, they want to take this.
So, Stephen, by my count, you got Lilly and Novo, you got, several of the farmers in this space have tipped their hand to amylin. They've got programs like you were just talking about. 2 or 3 haven't yet. How do you read that? You think we're going to see deal making? What do you think that means?
Well, partly I think it means I would not put it past some of them, or a lot of them, already having something, sort of in the hopper preclinically that we're just maybe unaware of. But if they don't, then yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think this is a space that, as we saw with the AbbVie Gubra deal, I think could potentially be one for, that's ripe for deal making. But I also just wanted to go back to someone to, I think part of the question you asked me before about sort of, the opportunity for Amylin, I guess that's kind of maybe the hot take, as you might say, with this from this story is when you're talking about sort of how obesity is treated now, essentially, everyone just kind of gets one thing. And I think as this sort of market sort of matures, I think you are going to start to see some segmentation. And I think that's where the real opportunities for Amylin presides, because as you mentioned, severe obesity, it's about 20 to 30%, depending on the study you look at, of the population. That's where you need the 25 to 30% weight loss. And I think that's where the incretins are going to live. But the vast majority of patients, as you already noted, they only need maybe 10 to 20%. And so if we can see, an amylin therapy that has better tolerability, better preferential fat burn, and if you can have sort of Wegovy-like, semaglutide-like efficacy, 15 to 18% or so weight loss, I think that's going to be a very attractive sort of product profile for the market. And I think there will be a lot of patients that would prefer to start there. The only maybe fly in this ointment that I think, we still will have to see is what happens with the oral therapies, because we're going to probably start soon this year. We're going to have phase 3 data for an oral incretin. Now, if the side effects, by all accounts, early data suggests that you're going to see exactly the same kind of side effect profile, maybe even worse tolerability with that. So you could still have this opportunity for amylin there. But yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out. And I think this is a really, I think it's going to be an even hotter target than we already think it is now.
Stephen, I want to shift gears a little bit here. Investors once again have reacted coolly to the latest cut of data from Novo. Can you bring us up to speed?
Yeah, so this was the second phase 3 for Novo's CagriSema, which is their combination of their amylin agonist cagrilintide with their GLP-1 semaglutide. We saw back in December, if you recall, they had, in a vacuum, they had great data, but unfortunately, I think they had set investors up to have this expectation that it was going to be a really big number in terms of the placebo-adjusted weight loss, and they didn't hit that number. And I think this is very much sort of in line with what we saw from that first study. So the first study was in obese patients without type 2 diabetes. This is the obese patients with type 2 diabetes study. So what we've kind of seen historically is when you treat patients that have diabetes, they tend to show lower weight loss than those that don't. So in this study, they showed a significant, weight loss relative to placebo, but the number was roughly, the placebo-adjusted number was roughly about what we saw with Zepbound in that same population. So I think they're getting dinged again because CagriSema is not differentiating from tirzepatide in the way that I think investors had hoped for. But again, this comes with the same caveats that the first study, the Redefine 1 study in December, came with, and that there was a flexible dosing protocol in the study. So patients could titrate up, they could titrate down. If they got up to a certain dose and their tolerability was an issue, they could go to a lower dose, or they could go up and they could have lost enough weight and decided, I don't need to go higher. So there's any number of reasons as to why they might have an up or down. But I think that's sort of the caveat that comes with this one, is that it's not an apples to apples comparison to the tirzepatide studies where patients titrate up, you're put on a dose and you titrate up to that, to the highest dose in that cohort. Again, in my mind, I think it's a bit of an overreaction, but we'll see later this year. There's head-to-head data coming later this year that I think are going to tell us a better story about what's happening. And I'm also just more interested in to see the full data when it comes out, because as we were just speaking about, they should have some data on cagrilintide's ability to preserve lean mass as one of the secondary endpoints in these studies. So I think that's what I'll be looking for later this year.
All right. Thanks for that, Stephen. And as we record this midday California time, Novo Nordisk down around 8%, been holding there. And for context, stock's down about 7% year to date. Check out Stephen's story. Listen to last week's podcast as well. Kind of got into that AbbVie deal, as he mentioned, and I will drop a link into the show notes. All right, I want to turn to last week's editor's commentary. Simone took a look at DEI. Simone.
Thanks, Jeff. So, I wrote this because, I don't know, it's been bubbling up in me. And then, on International Women's Day, I think I should be out there celebrating great women, which I do. But I also think that, I look at it and I'm like, we're really at a juncture with DEI, I think we are really entering a post-DEI era. And I have to tell you, this term DEI is just a flashpoint. And it's kind of a shame because I think most people will agree with some of the original intentions of DEI. And many people will agree that it's kind of gone awry to some degree. So I say, there's two things. One is there's actually broad appeal for dismantling DEI as a framework and for the rigidity that it's introduced. But there's also huge concern for what it's going to usher in. I think going back to what it is supposed to do, which is to create a more level playing field and to ensure diversity of opinions and backgrounds. And in our industry, in biopharma, that means, creating medicines and healthcare solutions that are effective and accessible and trusted across populations. And that means taking into account the lived experiences of diverse groups. So why does it matter if you don't have diversity in a leadership team? Well, one pretty obvious area we can look at is all male leadership teams have just done nothing. They've never prioritized or even understood, for example, women's health. I say that because it's International Women's Day, but it is true on many fronts. So I think there's an appetite for quote unquote correction on DEI. I think many people tell me that the government was elected with a mandate to do that. But I think there's also like this wholesale DEI rejection that has kind of, by this administration, it's really swung the pendulum so far that you have this kind of opposite Orwellian world. And I think it might do more harm than what it's replacing. And, examples are diversity in clinical trials and the way certain words have meant that you can't conduct research that is basically necessary for precision medicine. And why, apart from the fact that that's a problem, but one of the problems is that our industry leaders have been completely silent on this. And I hear a lot of people who are very, very concerned about that. So, where am I going with this? I think the point is, if you want to dismantle DEI, well, that's one thing, but what are you replacing it with? And if you don't have active measures to try and create diversity in your programs and in your leadership teams, it's supposed to be about a meritocracy. It's supposed to be about having the best people in your teams, in your leadership and in your staff. And if you don't have active programs to do that, what are you going to end up with? You're going to end up with what was in the past, which is like cronyism, right? I'm not going to point to specific areas where we're seeing that happen already, right? But clearly, just saying I don't want to, you can't just hire somebody because they're diverse for the quote unquote diverse for the sake of it. But at the same time, not having diverse people because they just don't overlap with your circles of friends doesn't really make any sense either.
So what are companies supposed to do, Simone?
Well, that's a good question. I don't have all the answers. If I did, I'd be a lot more successful than I am right now. But I do think that it is time to replace the framework of DEI, mostly because people have lost faith in it. But I think there's also a lot of other tools. So, for example, AI can actually go a long way to removing bias when you're hiring and promoting people, if you train it with the right priorities. There's new technologies that there weren't a while ago. You can use AI to scan resumes and so on. I think that there's this classic example, which is orchestras have moved to holding auditions behind a screen. It's called a blind audition, right? And it's really hard to argue against that. And that's actually led to a lot more diversity, a lot more women in orchestras. And I think that that's a template, that there are other ways to anonymize or so on who an applicant is for a very far way into the process. And, I think that people should rethink how important pedigree is. There's definitely a bias to saying, you went to this Ivy League or that Ivy League, where you get a great training in the Ivy Leagues. I've been to a great university myself. They don't necessarily teach you all the leadership skills that you might need. So they're not necessarily the great training ground for what you want in your leadership team. So I think, those are just a few things. I think there are other ones. I don't pretend to have it all. But I think it's really important to be focusing on an actual meritocracy rather than just something that makes you feel more comfortable, which is basically just going back to the smoke-filled rooms of old. And I think the companies that figure this out are going to do better. They're going to hire better people and they're going to succeed more. There's a lot of data showing that diverse management teams really produce better results, better returns for shareholders. So I think that there is actually something kind of market driven about this, but active programs to try and create diverse leadership teams, well, I'm still in favor of those.
Great stuff, Simone. You can check out Simone's editor's perspective at biocenturypodcast.com, and I'll drop a link into the show notes. And if you are liking what you're hearing, don't forget to leave us a review, subscribe, and check out our sister podcast, BioCentury Show. Last week, I sat down with BNP Paribas Zahed Monir to find out why he is so bullish on biotech. We talked M&A, PE, and biotech, and he says he's seeing an unprecedented range of enthusiasm for biotech. Find out why by tuning in. You can also check out video version on our YouTube channel. Thank you for tuning in, Simone, Steve, and Steven. Thanks for the thoughts. And hey, thanks as always to our production guru, Cole Travis, making it work in the PNW. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.